There are many inventions from medieval times that we still use today, like the printing press or eyeglasses. However, some medieval inventions served more nefarious purposes in a less enlightened age. So stick around, and here are the top 15 most scary medieval inventions. Number 15. The Iron Chair. Starting off our list is a chair that nobody ever wants to have to sit on. Also dubbed the torture chair, the iron chair features hundreds of sharp spikes all over the seat, back, and arms. There wasn't a single safe place on this thing. Victims of the iron chair were strapped in by their wrists, ankles, and neck, and further restrained by 2 crossbars. In total, there could be anywhere between 500 and 1,500 spikes to keep the victim in excruciating pain. And just in case the spikes weren't agonizing enough on this medieval torture device, there was a large hot stove burning underneath to heat the metal. Typically, anyone forced to sit here was left to bleed out and roast alive simultaneously. While the crimes punishable by the iron chair may have been some obvious ones like murder, lesser crimes like adultery were an excuse to strap someone in. And because it was medieval times, accusations of witchcraft against women were abundant and would also earn you a seat on this horrifying invention. Number 14. The Pear of Anguish. This invention looks like something out of our worst nightmares and is unfortunate proof of the level of morbid medieval creativity. With a name like the Pear of Anguish, it's pretty easy to guess what this was used for. The device was forcibly inserted into certain human orifices, and both interrogation and torture ensue. Victims were forced to give information, and if their abuser wasn't satisfied with their answers or was just plain sadistic, they would turn a screw, causing the pear to gradually open while still inside the body. The pressure builds to the point where soft tissue is ripped and torn from the inside. Because of large numbers of nerves in that area of the human body, the pain was agonizing and felt throughout the body. The purpose of the Pear of Anguish, though, was to never kill, but only to inflict some serious damage. Reportedly, the device was even used in victims' mouths as a way to keep them quiet. Number 13. The Lead Sprinkler. This horrifying invention was also known as the Holy Water Sprinkler, but don't let the name fool you. Its purpose was far more nefarious than it was holy. The lead sprinkler was a rod-like device with a removable sphere or bulb on one end. On the other end, the user could pour boiling water, oil, or molten lead and let it run through to the other side. The sphere on the end was filled with holes, and when flicked, typically at its victim's head and face, the contents would sprinkle and splatter out, hence its name. And while this scary invention obviously inflicted an unearthly deal of pain, the end goal was the death of anyone on the receiving end, and the most common form of execution with the lead sprinkler was used to pour hot molten silver into a person's eyes. Oof, yikes. Number 12. Heretic's Fork. Not the type of fork you can find on the dinner table. The Heretic's Fork was a choice invention of the religious fanatics. The fork was double-sided and attached to a collar around the victim's neck. One end of the fork sat perfectly under the chin, while the other was nice and snug against the breastplate. It left them with one of 2 options. They could either continue to lift their heads straight up in an attempt to outlast their torturer, which is incredibly painful in its own right, or they could succumb to the pressure and have both their chest and neck punctured. Like any medieval torture device, it was often a lose-lose situation, and even the slightest movement of the head could have spelled the end for anyone unlucky enough to be on the receiving end. Unfortunately, death was inevitable, and the Heretic's Fork was used on anyone who was deemed to be ungodly, which would include women accused of being witches. To add insult to injury, the fork was often inscribed with the words, "I recant," representing the victim's willingness to recant their sins, whether guilty or not. Number 11. Crocodile Shears. Made famous in late medieval Europe, the crocodile shears were reserved for the worst offenders and typically used on men who were caught attempting to assassinate the king. And at the time, there was no shortage of those. The crocodile shears were made of metal, but acted more as pincers than they did scissors. The insides of the shears were always lined with spikes, but some models even added blades to the individual spikes to remind its victims just how serious their crimes were. But the crocodile shears were never used cold, not even at room temperature. They were first left in the fire to reach dangerously hot temperatures even for those who had to hold it. And once the torture began, the wielder almost always started with the victim's genitalia, tearing them from the body. Because of the high heat, the wound would typically cauterize, preventing a quick death by bleeding out from severed arteries. Number 10. Plague Doctor Mask. Moving away from human violence but remaining in the realm of scary and macabre are the masks worn by doctors during the medieval bubonic plague. And while the doctors and nurses were there to help, their outfits at the time were pure nightmare fuel. They wore a full, thick leather garb, a bird-like mask, and naturally a top hat to add to the finishing touch. But it was the beaked mask that will keep you up at night. It still served a purpose, no matter how ineffective it may have been in the end. The beak of the mask is stuffed with herbs and incense to protect the doctors from getting a whiff of the Black Death, which included open sores and, of course, the decaying bodies of the deceased in the streets. And to make matters even worse, the vast majority of plague doctors had little to no medical training, meaning the afflicted were often given improper treatment. And while the plague doctor's mask is still an eerie sight, it's an early precursor to the modern-day hazmat suit. Number 9. Thumbscrews. The thumbscrews are a well-known invention for torture from medieval Europe and are quite simple in their execution. The victim's thumbs are placed in a small vise with protruding studs on the interior and are held in place with a screw. You can probably guess what happens next. The screw is turned slowly but surely until the victim's thumbs were completely crushed and thereby rendered useless for the rest of their days. Typically used on prisoners, it was also common for it to be used on their toes as well. The metal-crushing bars could even also be lined with metal blades to puncture the nail beds and inflict an even greater pain. As time went on, torturers became bored with the thumbscrews and thought outside of the box. They soon built a bigger device that could fit a victim's full hands, feet, and even ears. The thumbscrews are a perfect example of how sometimes the smallest of inventions can leave us with the biggest scares. We are constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button. Number 8. The Man Catcher. Before the creation of the dog catcher, there was the man catcher. This device was used during battles to pluck knights straight from their horses, but this invention looked absolutely terrifying. While the man catcher is meant to be non-lethal, it's hard to believe when you see its dubious design. A long metal pole with prongs at the end, it's allegedly meant to wrap around a knight's armor without puncturing it. And while this invention looks like it's best used for a swift death, its most practical use was to capture enemies to later be held for ransom. If you're part of the cavalry and see a troop coming toward you with a man catcher, you best turn your horse around and head for the hills, because this is not something anyone wants to be ensnared with. Number 7. Greek Fire. Fire on its own can be a scary natural event, but the medieval Greeks were able to harness the power of nature and take it to the next level with what is known as Greek Fire. What made this invention so frightening is that it was created using chemical compounds that prevent the fire from being extinguished. Coupled with the fact that the thick substance can stick to walls, flesh, and even burn on water, it made for a formidable and foreboding sight on the battlefield. More commonly, the Greek fire was put into glass jars and hurled at enemies. It was also known to be used with a hose, allowing for it to reach even further distances. A more famous instance when Greek fire was used against other humans was during the defense of Constantinople against an Arab fleet, setting their ships ablaze before ever making it onto shore. Number 6. Spring Bow. Another serious medieval hazard is the invention of the spring bow. The name says it all. It's a spring-loaded bow that acts as a trap and shoots its unsuspecting victim with an arrow. But what makes this so scary? Well, it could be used just about anywhere and in any way. One such instance occurred in the 10th century Scotland when King Kenneth II was tricked into moving a statue that was loaded with plenty of spring bows that let loose, shooting him dead on sight. In another story of the spring bow, King Edmund Ironside of England fell victim to one while on the privy. That's medieval lingo for a toilet. So the late, maybe not so great King Edmund went to relieve himself. With a hidden string attached to the seat of his privy or toilet, the spring bow shot straight up when he sat down. Oof, that's gotta hurt. Number 5. Iron Maiden. Easily one of the most fearsome and terrifying medieval inventions, the Iron Maiden has earned its notorious place in history. Used as both a means of torture and execution, this is not a fate anyone wants to meet. Not to be confused with your dad's favorite metal band, the Iron Maiden was a large, upright metal coffin with plenty of sharp, rusty, and oftentimes already bloodied metal spikes inside of it. The victim was placed inside and left to suffer their dark fate, literally. Because if giant spikes aren't enough, being alone in the dark can be scary even on its own. If they're large enough, victims are immediately impaled as soon as the door's closed. But if they're too small, well, there's nowhere to go once inside. Even the smallest movement could either end in a quick death by an ill-placed spike, or a slow one if it punctures any arteries. And on the off chance that the victim is able to stave off being stabbed, well, then they can starve to death. That is, if they don't collapse from exhaustion. Most who went in never came out, but oddly enough, there are a few cases of some lucky survivors, though none of whom walked away unscathed. Number 4. The Spanish Donkey. During medieval times, the church often called the shots, and religious zealots roamed on the streets. One particular invention of the Spanish Inquisitors was the Spanish donkey, and boy is this one rough. Many victims deemed heretics were subject to this device. Very few were able to walk away afterwards. Victims were forced to mount this wooden donkey, which was a large wedge raised off the ground and had nails, spikes, or blades protruding from the seat. Once mounted, the victims' hands were tied behind their backs, and large stone weights were shackled to their feet, letting gravity do the work by sinking their body deeper into the brutal wedge between their legs. Obvious and intense pain ensued, and the Spanish donkey was sure to cripple anyone who sat upon its back. Number 3. The Judas Cradle. This one is as rough as it is scary. Invented in medieval Italy, the Judas Cradle was a torture device saved for adulterers or anyone else philandering outside the confines of marriage. First, the victim would be stripped completely naked, tied up, then raised directly above the triangular cradle. Once their orifice was in line with the cradle's sharp tip, they were very slowly and excruciatingly lowered down. And if someone didn't sink down far enough, all the torturer had to do was to shackle weights to their ankles. The process could take hours, with the cradle stretching and tearing the victim's insides, which would result in death. But if that didn't come quickly enough because the Judas Cradle was never cleaned, many victims would die of infection first, meaning they had been sitting there for days. Number 2. The Nest of Bees. Scared of bees? Well, this next invention from medieval China may be one to steer clear of. Although there aren't any actual bees involved, the nest of bees still packs quite a nasty sting. Most likely invented in the 11th century, this was a long hexagonal tube filled with dozens of rocket-tipped arrows. The opening of the tube was broad, allowing the rocket arrows to disperse once it opened. Invented shortly after gunpowder, this was one experiment you do not want to be on the receiving end of. Close to 30 arrows were shot at once across the battlefield, and if the impact or blood loss didn't kill the enemy, then the poison and flaming tips did. And because they were so small and simple, thousands could be deployed against an advancing army at once. Adding to the fear of being stung by one of the bees, they buzzed and howled as they flew through the air and left a thick trail of smoke in its wake. The nest of bees is scary as it is cruel. Number 1. Braze Bull. Taking the top spot on our list as the scariest medieval invention is the Braze Bull. Despite everything we've seen so far, this has to be the cruelest form of punishment. Shaped like the animal of its namesake, the Braze Bull was made of brass, completely hollow, and just large enough to fit a person inside. Prisoners, criminals, and murderers were the typical victims who were placed inside against their will. But what's so bad about being shoved in a bronze bull? Well, a fire was lit underneath, heating the Braze Bull to unfathomable temperatures, with the person still inside. It wasn't uncommon for the bull to be made with holes in the mouth and nostrils, allowing the smoke to billow out and give it a lifelike appearance while the victims screamed inside as they burned alive. Watch our scary playlist for more top 15 videos about the most scary subjects. Sit back, relax, and binge watch all of our best videos.